You were a part of Michael Jackson's inner circle for many years. Are the allegations true?
I would never associate myself with anybody. He was into women. He had a problem with women.
Imagine standing outside a locked bedroom door in a rented Holmby Hills mansion, holding a loaded firearm, knowing the most famous human on earth is inside, and your only job is keeping his own family out.
He lived and breathed being Michael Jackson. Whenever you saw him, that was an act. There was no way he was going to show the world. He used to say to us, I want my life to be the biggest mystery on earth.
No cameras, no flashing lights, just a heavy, haunting quiet. For years, headlines painted a picture of a man isolated by choice, spinning out of control. But what if the people paid to breathe the same air every single day saw something completely different? How did the ultimate pop icon end up a prisoner in his own final act? What the guards actually witnessed. When the public looks back at the final years of the King of Pop, they see the curated noise of the headlines, the 2005 trial, the wandering years in Bahrain and Ireland, and the sudden, breathless press conference in London that signaled the "this is it" era. But if you want to understand the man behind the myth and the reality behind his final collapse, you don't talk to the suit-and-tie executives who were cashing the checks. You talk to the guys who stood by the blacked-out SUVs in the dead of winter, the ones who spent their nights monitoring the perimeter while Michael tried to sleep. You talk to Bill Whitfield and Javon Beard. These men weren't just hired security. They were the absolute ironclad buffer between a man who had become the world's most prized possession and the world itself. They were the ones who checked the doors, scoped the hotels, and most importantly, kept their mouths shut. And what they saw behind those closed doors completely guts the tabloid narrative that Michael was an unhinged, detached eccentric floating through reality on a cloud of bizarre whims. Let's start with the logistical nightmare of his daily existence. Imagine being responsible for the most recognizable face in human history. Every move, every stop at a grocery store, every hotel check-in was a covert military operation. Whitfield and Beard have described the sheer, exhausting pace of these final years where a simple rumor of a leak could lead to a frantic midnight evacuation. They would be holed up in a luxury hotel, and suddenly, a threat would be flagged, or worse, a leak would hit the press that compromised their location. For the rest of us, that's an inconvenience. For Michael, it was a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. The guards would get the call, scramble to wake up Prince, Paris, and Blanket, and load them into a caravan of vehicles, driving into the pitch black of night with no specific destination in mind. The most human detail here? The kids rarely knew why they were moving. To them, it was just the rhythm of their life. Another hotel, another suite, another adventure. Michael was obsessively dedicated to keeping the rot of his professional world from tainting his children's innocence. He wanted to be a normal dad. He wanted to have movie nights, play video games, and have silly conversations. He was constantly struggling to compartmentalize, trying to keep the Michael Jackson brand separate from the father who just wanted to protect his kids from the paparazzi vultures circling overhead. He wasn't some detached alien. He was a man trying to construct a sanctuary out of thin air in a world that wouldn't let him breathe. But you can only build so many sanctuaries before the walls start to shrink. The guards witnessed the slow, systematic erosion of his spirit. They were there when he'd walk through a crowd and hear the cacophony of 1,000 screaming fans, half of them there for love, the other half there to jeer, taunt, or record a video that would inevitably be twisted to mock him. Michael would often retreat to the back seat of the SUV, pull his hat down, and turn to his guards with a look of genuine, haunting confusion. He'd ask, almost as if he were checking for a phantom noise, "Did you hear that? Did someone say something mean?" The guards would instinctively lie to him. They'd shake their heads, tell him he heard wrong, tell him they were all cheering for him. They did it because they knew that if Michael confirmed the cruelty, if he let the weight of the public's malice sink into his consciousness, he would panic. He would spiral. He would demand to leave, to board a flight, to hide in a basement somewhere. He was, in his final years, a man whose skin had been stripped away by decades of intense global scrutiny. His guards also revealed the absolute crushing weight of the 1993 allegations. Even years later, this was a ghost that never left his side. In private, behind the closed doors where the masks came off, Michael would often bring it up himself. He would look at his security team and, with a terrifying, hollow sincerity, say, "I would never hurt a child. I would slit my wrists first." This wasn't a performance for the press. This was a man who felt the need to declare his innocence to the people who were paid to watch him live. He lived with the constant, crushing knowledge that his name had been weaponized, and the legal advice he'd received to settle in the 90s, which he only did to stop the bleeding, had actually just given the tabloid press the blueprint to destroy him forever. What the guards knew, above everything else, was that Michael was a man under a siege that nobody could see. He didn't trust the people handling his business interests. He didn't trust the promoters who were salivating over his legacy. And as his health began to decline, he couldn't even trust his own team to manage his basic affairs. His guards were often left in a position where they were acting as his only true support system, protecting a man who owned the rights to the most valuable music catalog in the world, yet frequently couldn't pay his own staff's salaries. This leads us to the most frustrating piece of the puzzle. If the man was this exhausted, if he was this deeply insecure about his public image, and if he was clearly struggling with the physical demands of his own legacy, how on earth did we get to the point of, this is it? How does a man who is literally struggling to pay his staff sign a contract for 50 stadium shows in London? Everything seems to point toward a trap, doesn't it? The mathematical impossibility of 50 shows. How does a man who can barely walk through a hotel lobby without a security detail supporting his weight suddenly agree to the most physically demanding concert residency in modern music history? To understand the tragedy of 2009, you have to stop looking at Michael Jackson as an artist and start looking at him as an asset. A multi-million-dollar asset that was deeply, terrifyingly in debt. By the time the early months of 2009 rolled around, Michael's lifestyle, combined with predatory loans and a staggering lack of liquid cash, had backed him into a corner. Enter E.G. Live, the entertainment giants who saw a golden opportunity to stage the ultimate comeback. But what began as a modest agreement quickly morphed into a mathematical and physical death sentence. The original pitch was simple, almost manageable. 10 shows at London's O2 Arena. 10 nights to say goodbye, to secure his children's financial future, and to prove to the doubters that he still held the crown. Michael reluctantly agreed. He knew his body wasn't what it was during the Thriller or Bad eras, but 10 shows? He could pace himself. He could rely on production value, staging, and the sheer magic of his presence to carry him through. But the moment the tickets went on sale, the corporate machinery kicked into overdrive. Millions of fans flooded the digital queues. Demand didn't just break records. It shattered the entire ticketing infrastructure. Seeing the dollar signs multiply in real time, the promoters didn't stop at 10. They added more dates, then more. Before Michael even fully understood what was happening, the residency had ballooned from a tight 10-night run into a staggering 50-show marathon. 50 nights in front of 20,000 people a night, stretching all the way into 2010. When Michael was finally told about the extension, his reaction wasn't one of triumph. It was pure, unadulterated terror. His bodyguards recall him breaking down, visibly shaking as the reality set in. He repeatedly looked at his inner circle and said, "I don't know how I'm going to do 50 shows. I'm not in shape to do that many." The math of a Michael Jackson performance was brutal. He didn't just stand at a microphone and sing standard ballads. He was an explosive, high-impact athlete on stage. During a typical 2-hour concert, his choreography required an immense amount of cardiovascular output. In his prime, He would lose anywhere from 5 to 10 pounds of water weight per performance due to the sheer intensity of his movement. Now, picture doing that at 50 years old, after years of physical inactivity, chronic stress, and a dangerous dependence on prescription medications just to cope with insomnia. It was a physical impossibility. He didn't have the body mass index, the muscle density, or the stamina left to survive that kind of prolonged physical punishment. Yet, the contract was signed, and the wheels were turning. The corporate pressure on his shoulders was immense. If he pulled out, the financial penalties would have completely bankrupted him, likely resulting in the loss of his most prized possession. The Sony/ATV music publishing catalog, which held the rights to the Beatles' greatest hits. Michael was essentially trapped in a high-stakes game of financial chicken. He had to perform to keep his head above water, but the act of performing was actively draining whatever physical reserves he had left. His weight began to plummet dramatically during the Los Angeles rehearsals at the Staples Center. Staff members whispered about how frail he looked under his baggy clothes, comparing him to a ghost moving across the stage. While the public saw promotional trailers of a vibrant, moonwalking superstar preparing for a triumphant return, his security team was watching a man slowly breaking apart under the weight of expectations. He wasn't sleeping. The anxiety of the upcoming London dates was eating him alive from the inside out. He knew the world was waiting to see him fail, and the math of those 50 shows meant there was zero room for error, zero time for recovery, and zero regard for his humanity. He was a corporate locomotive speeding toward a brick wall, and the people holding the throttle were too busy counting the projected revenue to notice the engine was running on empty. But the pressure wasn't just coming from the concert promoters, room bribes, and the battle for publishing rights. While the concert promoters were busy locking in those stadium dates, a far more sinister invasion was breaching the perimeter of Michael's personal life. If you think the pressure on a global superstar stops at the front gates of his estate, you don't know the dark underbelly of the music industry. In his final months, Michael's rented mansion became ground zero for a quiet corporate war, and his own bedroom door was the front line. His bodyguards have pulled back the curtain on a level of corporate desperation that sounds less like showbiz and more like a political thriller. As the financial walls closed in around Jackson, a revolving door of managers, lawyers, and predatory middlemen began circling the property like sharks smelling blood in the water. They knew Michael was at his most vulnerable, exhausted from rehearsals, isolated from his actual family, and heavily medicated just to cope with the stress. And they all wanted one specific thing: his signature. Specifically, they wanted him to sign away pieces of his crown jewel, the Sony/ATV music publishing catalog. This wasn't just a collection of songs. It held the rights to the Beatles' greatest hits, an asset worth hundreds of millions of dollars that kept Michael financially relevant even when his touring revenue was zero. To get that signature, these industry operatives were willing to do whatever it took, including trying to corrupt the very men paid to protect him. Bill Whitfield and Javon Beard revealed that shifty industry figures and self-proclaimed handlers would pull the security detail aside in the driveway or outside hotel rooms, offering staggering under-the-table bribes. We are talking about briefcase cash, up to $50,000 on the spot, just to look the other way for 10 minutes. The goal? To bypass the security protocol, slide into Michael's private quarters while he was heavily sedated or completely disoriented from exhaustion, and force a pen into his hand to sign new contracts, lock in predatory loan structures, or surrender his publishing power. The guards flatly refused the money, remaining intensely loyal to a boss who, ironically, hadn't been able to pay their own salaries in months. Because the financial management around Michael was an absolute disaster zone run by competing factions, the security team was working completely on credit, watching their own bank accounts drain, while turning down fortunes from the vultures at the door. They realized that if they didn't stand as a physical wall at that bedroom door, the people Michael trusted with his legacy would have stripped him bare before he ever made it to a plane for London. He was a man being systematically hunted in his own home, treated not as a human being in a medical crisis, but as a living bank vault that needed to be cracked before it stopped ticking. The level of stress this placed on Michael was unimaginable. He knew people were after his catalog, and he grew deeply paranoid, constantly asking his guards to sweep his rooms for listening devices or hidden cameras. He was trapped in a golden cage, surrounded by people who only valued him for what he could sign away on a dotted line. But how did a man surrounded by so much corporate greed actually treat the everyday people on his payroll when the world wasn't looking? To truly understand what was unraveling in 2009, you have to look at the massive disconnect between the eccentric caricature painted by the media and the actual man who interacted with his staff when the cameras were off. The tabloids loved to depict Michael Jackson as a detached, demanding diva who floated through his mansion screaming orders at a terrified workforce. But if you talk to his actual employees, his housekeepers, his drivers, and the bodyguards who protected him around the clock, the reality they describe is completely different, and honestly, a lot more tragic. Away from the blinding flashbulbs, Michael was incredibly quiet, intensely polite, and deeply defensive of his privacy. He wasn't running around his house wearing elaborate stage costumes or his trademark military jackets. He wore baggy sweatpants, simple t-shirts, and spent his time doing ordinary things like reading books or watching cartoons with his kids. His staff called him the boss or Mr. Jackson, but he always treated them with a level of soft-spoken courtesy that caught new employees entirely off guard. He would constantly use please and thank you, and if he needed something in the middle of the night, he would rarely demand it. He would sheepishly ask if it was too much trouble for someone to help him. The relationship between Michael and his primary security team, particularly Bill Whitfield and Javon Beard, wasn't just a standard employer-employee dynamic. Because Michael had systematically cut off or been forced away from so many people in his life, his bodyguards became his de facto confidants. They weren't just monitoring the security cameras, they were the ones he would talk to when he was lonely. The ones who went to the store to buy toys for his kids, and the ones who witnessed his deepest anxieties. Whitfield recalls times when Michael would just want to sit in the passenger seat of an SUV parked in a dark driveway for hours, completely silent, just to feel like he was outside the house without being chased. But this loyalty was put to the ultimate test when the financial infrastructure supporting Michael completely collapsed. In the final years leading up to 2009, the competing managers and chaotic legal battles meant that Michael's liquid funds were frozen or completely mismanaged. The money simply stopped flowing. This meant that the people working closest to him, the drivers, the maids, and the security detail, went months without receiving a single paycheck. For the bodyguards, this stretched on for an incredible 5 consecutive months. They had families to feed, mortgages to pay, and credit cards that were maxing out. In any normal corporate environment, the entire staff would have walked out on day one. But they stayed. They stayed because they saw a vulnerable father who was completely oblivious to how badly his managers were screwing him over, and they knew that if they left, the vultures waiting outside the gates would swarm the house instantly. When Michael finally realized his staff hadn't been paid, he didn't react with anger or corporate indifference. He was deeply mortified. He apologized profusely, crying in front of his guards, and scrambled to find whatever cash or assets he could to make things right. He valued their loyalty like family, because, in his world, loyalty was the rarest commodity of all. Even his famous eccentricities, which the media weaponized against him, were viewed differently by his staff. His bodyguards revealed that things like wearing surgical masks in public or putting tape on his fingers weren't signs of a mind losing touch with reality. It was a calculated marketing trick. Michael explicitly told his guards that when he wanted to stay in the news cycle without doing any promo, he would just wear a mask outside. The paparazzi would go wild. The tabloids would run a front-page story calling him weird, and his name would stay at the top of the cultural conversation. It was a game he played with the media, a shield he used to control the narrative when he couldn't control his own life. But as the rehearsals for the London tour intensified, that calculated control began to slip away entirely. The gentle, polite boss, who loved to read books to his kids, was slowly being replaced by a frantic, sleep-deprived ghost who was physically shrinking before his employees' eyes. The corporate pressure was mounting, his body was failing, and the quiet sanctuary his staff had fought so hard to protect inside the mansion walls was about to be breached by a medical intervention that would ultimately seal his fate. And that brings us directly to the final, fatal countdown inside that house. The final 24 hours, rehearsals, restlessness, and gross negligence. June 24, 2009, started like any other high-stress day in the final stretch of prep for the London residency. Michael arrived at the Staples Center in Los Angeles for what would turn out to be his very last rehearsal. To the crew and the backup dancers on stage, he looked remarkably sharp. He ran through Thriller and Earth Song, showing flashes of the precise electric energy that made him a global phenomenon. Magician Ed Alonzo, who was working on the show's illusions, noted that Michael looked vibrant and happy. But the moment the music stopped and Michael stepped off that stage, the illusion shattered. The grueling rehearsal had drained whatever liquid energy his frail body had left. He was running on pure adrenaline and sheer panic. When Michael arrived back at his rented Holmby Hills mansion past midnight, he was a physical and mental wreck. The high of the performance quickly gave way to a crippling, familiar dread: insomnia. He knew that if he didn't sleep, he couldn't rehearse the next day. And if he couldn't rehearse, the 50-show corporate tower cards would come crashing down on his head. This is where the dark figure of Dr. Conrad Murray entered the frame. Murray wasn't a standard family doctor. He was an expensive, specialized cardiologist hired specifically to keep Michael functioning through this high-stakes tour, paid a staggering $150,000 a month by the promoters. But instead of providing medical care, Murray's job description had essentially devolved into chemically forcing Michael's brain to shut down every single night. According to police records and court testimonies, the timeline of that final night is a horrifying look into pharmaceutical desperation. Starting around 1:30 a.m., Murray began a dangerous cocktail of sedatives. He gave Michael a dose of Valium. It didn't work. An hour later, he injected him with Ativan. Michael lay awake, eyes wide, staring at the ceiling. By 5 a.m., Murray administered another sedative, Versed. Still, Michael's mind was racing, completely consumed by the crushing weight of the upcoming tour. By 10 a.m., a desperate, exhausted Michael begged Murray for what he called his milk, his personal nickname for propofol, a potent, milky white intravenous anesthetic reserved strictly for hospital surgical rooms. Murray succumbed to the pressure. At approximately 10:40 a.m., he set up an IV drip and administered 25 milligrams of propofol in a standard bedroom environment lacking any of the mandatory medical monitoring equipment, such as an EKG machine or a pulse oximeter. Within moments, Michael finally lost consciousness. But instead of staying by the bedside of a heavily anesthetized patient, a fundamental rule of administering propofol, Murray did the unthinkable. He walked out of the room. Court records later revealed that during the critical window where Michael's breathing began to slow to a halt, Murray was on his cell phone, spending over 45 minutes making personal calls and chatting with his girlfriend. When Murray finally walked back into the bedroom around 11:51 a.m., he realized with a jolt of panic that Michael wasn't breathing. His pulse was fading. But instead of immediately dialing 911, Murray began a chaotic, highly incompetent cover-up attempt. He tried to administer CPR on a soft bed instead of a hard floor, which is entirely ineffective. He scrambled to clean up the room, packing away empty vials and IV bags into a closet, before instructing Michael's frantic personal chef and security team to help him. A staggering 82 minutes passed between the time Murray found Michael unresponsive and the moment someone finally called emergency services at 12:21 p.m. By the time the paramedics arrived, Michael's eyes were fixed and dilated. They attempted to revive him for nearly an hour on site and in the ambulance on the way to the UCLA Medical Center, but it was already over. The King of Pop had left the building long before the sirens started wailing down Sunset Boulevard. The official cause of death would later be ruled as acute propofol intoxication, compounded by a deadly mixture of benzodiazepines. It wasn't a secret assassination orchestrated by a shadowy elite, nor was it a random overdose by an addict out of control. It was a textbook case of gross medical negligence, driven by an expensive doctor trying to keep a multi-million-dollar asset awake enough to feed a corporate machine. But as the news of his death leaked to the world, the real chaos was only just beginning. An aftermath, when the cameras turned back on. The moment the news broke, the entire global media ecosystem shattered. Websites crashed, telephone lines jammed, and outside the UCLA Medical Center, a sea of cameras and weeping fans materialized within minutes. But away from the flashing lights of that public circus, inside the empty mansion at Holmby Hills, a much darker reality was setting in. Michael's bodyguards stood in the quiet hallways, watching the immediate, ruthless shift in how the world treated the man they had spent years protecting. The second his heart stopped beating, Michael Jackson ceased being a human being under intense pressure and instantly transformed back into a highly lucrative corporate entity. The immediate scramble for his assets was nothing short of predatory. While his children were being shielded in a back room, weeping for their father, the very lawyers, managers, and corporate operatives who had been blocked at the bedroom door weeks prior were suddenly drafting press releases. The This Is It tour footage, captured during those final Los Angeles rehearsals, was fast-tracked into a multi-million-dollar documentary film. The ironies were sickening to the staff, who knew the truth. The same promoters who had pushed Michael into a mathematical impossibility of 50 shows were now marketing his final exhausted footsteps as a global celebration of his enduring genius. Death, it turned out, was the ultimate career move for the executives looking to recoup their investments. Meanwhile, the legal system slowly ground its gears to address the medical negligence that ended his life. In 2011, Dr. Conrad Murray stood trial for involuntary manslaughter. The courtroom drama exposed the graphic details of that final morning, proving to the world that Michael hadn't died from some mysterious, glamorous rock and roll curse, but from a total failure of basic medical ethics in a messy bedroom. Murray was convicted and sentenced to 4 years in prison, though he only served 2 due to California prison overcrowding. For the fans and the family, it was a hollow victory that barely scratched the surface of the institutional greed that had enabled the tragedy in the first place. For the bodyguards who had worked on credit, turning down massive cash bribes out of sheer loyalty, the silence that followed was deafening. They watched as the media rewritten the history of their boss, shifting the focus back to the sensationalized tabloid myths while completely ignoring the fragile, isolated father who just wanted to watch cartoons with his kids. The lies exposing his death weren't hidden in a government vault or buried in a complex criminal conspiracy. They were sitting right there in plain sight, woven directly into the fabric of an industry that treats artists as disposable commodities. Michael Jackson had spent his entire life running from the flashing lights, but in the end, it was the crushing weight of the machinery behind those lights that ensured he would never truly escape. And that's the real tragedy of how the curtain fell on the King of Pop. It wasn't a hidden Hollywood conspiracy or a secret society hit. It was the crushing weight of a massive corporate machine, a desperate financial trap, and a compromised doctor who treated a fragile human being like an unbreakable cash cow. The Bodyguard saw the truth long before the rest of the world did. Michael Jackson didn't lose his mind. He simply ran out of time in a world that refused to let him rest. Now the question is, how will history choose to remember his final act? If you want more deep dives into the real stories behind the headlines, hit that subscribe button.